Hey everyone. So I want to kick off Down Syndrome Awareness Month, talking about research articles. And this is something that I thought was important because as a caregiver and a researcher myself, I was always angry sometimes at what the media would say or sensationalize as headlines, or how people might take information away from an article and interpret it for themselves. So I'm going to kick it off with like a much more simpler article, if you will, talking about how the number of physical or phenotypic traits an individual has may or may not correlate with their level of intelligence or cognition. And to help me talk about this study, which I think is actually pretty fascinating and will help potentially give us all a different view on individuals with Down syndrome, I created a little PowerPoint to share with you. So I'm going to click on over to this PowerPoint and share it with you. And this is the study that I talked about, that I want to talk about today. So understanding physical traits in Down syndrome. This is my parent-friendly summary on the research that was done in this. And this is done on an article that was published in 2022 by a group out of Italy. So this study really matters because doctors use physical traits to help diagnose Down syndrome. I know when Kate was born, my daughter, who's now 10, one of the first things they did is after she was born, they came back to me and they said, "We think your daughter has Down syndrome." And one of the ways they were able to do this is they were to identify a couple of physical traits that she had. As parents, we all know that individuals with Down syndrome have certain physical traits. Some are more prevalent than others. But we wanted to really visit this classical checklist that was developed in 1970s by a gentleman named Jackson and his colleague Lewis. He started to explore some physical traits and actually identified 25 of them were pretty much the most predominant among individuals with Down syndrome. And also, this study explores whether the number of physical traits relate to learning abilities. So physical traits are phenotypic features in individuals with Down syndrome. We've all seen many of these images, especially if you're a caregiver or someone with Down syndrome, on what a person with Down syndrome looks like. Anywhere from small ears, small mouth, protruding tongue, the size of their neck, the gap between their toe, or also known as sandal toe. There's a number of different phenotypic traits that doctors can leverage and use in diagnosing individuals with Down syndrome before they even receive the genetic testing to identify that extra copy of the chromosome. But those 25 phenotypic traits that Jackson identified are all listed here in this table. And a lot of these can be equated to physical traits, and many of us are pretty familiar with some of this. So brachycephaly, folded ear, short neck, epicanthic eye folds, which is like almond eyes, flat nasal bridges, abnormal teeth, congenital heart defects or murmurs, hypotonia, high arch plate, narrow palate, all sorts of things that individuals with Down syndrome can have. So what these researchers did is they studied 233 individuals with Down syndrome using Jackson's 1976 checklist that he and his colleague Lewis identified. They wanted to check how many traits each person had and look for patterns among those traits. In addition, they assessed 114 of these participants on cognitive skills and did some correlation analysis, which is basically fancy statistics, to understand if there's any correlation between individuals based on the number of their phenotypic traits present and their level of cognitive skills. So what they identified in the study is that most individuals with Down syndrome had at least 12 of these traits. None of the individuals in this study had less than 5. And keep in mind, there's only 233 participants in this study. So there can still be individuals out there with Down syndrome that have fewer than 5 of these traits and absolutely have all 25, although that has been noted as being more rare. So this also confirms the use of the checklist is still pretty clinical for diagnosis, meaning that of these 25 traits, these are pretty commonly identified, but they're not always identified in the same combination, and every individual with Down syndrome will have a different presence of these phenotypic traits. However, the most common 3 physical traits that appeared together were rounder head shape, shorter broad hands, and also a shortened neck. Of these 3 phenotypes, these were the most commonly identified together in individuals with Down syndrome, but this still doesn't mean that an individual can or may not have any one of these physical traits. It's very dependent on the individual as to which number or combination of physical traits they will have. The other thing they identified in this is in comparing cognitive skills and physical traits, they found there was no link between physical traits and cognitive skills. And one way they analyzed this is they looked at the number of phenotypic or physical traits in individuals with Down syndrome that participated in this study, and they grouped them in numbers. So 18 or more, 13 or more, 10 or more, 5 or more, and they compared all of those groups together. So if they looked at a group that had 13 of the traits and the other group did not have 13 of the traits, they did a statistical test to analyze those two groups to see if there's any correlation between them. What they found was that there was no statistical correlation or significance between those groups, and they also paired up the number of phenotypic physical traits in different numbers that led them to all agree with profound convincing that appearance does not predict potential learning. So the number of physical traits and cognitive skills do not relate to one another. So what this does is it really supports a more personalized, inclusive care aspect where we can look at individuals as individuals with Down syndrome. So the old mantra that goes, if you know one person with Down syndrome, you know one person with Down syndrome. Why this matters to families is it matters because physical traits help a diagnosis, but they don't define your child's abilities. So if your child at birth or at a young age has a significant number of these phenotypic or physical traits that you're reading about, it doesn't mean that's going to define what they can and cannot do in the future. Every child with Down syndrome is unique. And this research here also helps to challenge outdated stereotypes, where we used to think, and some people may still think, that the number of phenotypes or physical traits that an individual with Down syndrome has determines their level of cognition or ability, which this study has absolutely stated and cited that that is not true. So this is the study that I was talking about today. This was done in 2023 is when it was published, but the work was first submitted to the journal in 2022. And the title of the study is called Phenotypic Signs and Cognitive Assessment in Down Syndrome, Revisiting Jackson's Checklist in 233 Subjects, Journal of Intellectual Disability Research. So if you have any questions about this study or would like to learn more about it, you can also contact me. My email is mamachromosome@gmail.com. I appreciate you guys swinging by and listening to this video and learning more about Down syndrome and research.